All right, welcome everyone. It is now noon. My name is Megan Purdue. I'm the Ag Agent in Worcester County, Maryland, down on the Lower Shore. This is our very last session for the Backyard Farming Series, at least for the spring and the summer. This is the last of the 4 consecutive Monday Move sessions focused on cattle production. We're going to be taking a break over the summer, not really a break because I just have a lot of other work to catch up on. We're going to evaluate the program. You may see a survey, an online survey come through your inbox. We would appreciate it if you would participate in that. That's just going to give us some more in-depth information about some of the demographics of our attendees and what you got out of the series and how we should proceed with it moving forward. So especially if you do enjoy this type of stuff, definitely participate in that because it does help us to plan for future sessions and to prove that the series is doing what it was intended to do and that people are finding value in it. Again, if you have any ideas for future topics, you can always message those to us. If it's cattle related, you could send it to Dr. Potts or to Rachel Slattery, any of the presenters that are working with the cattle series, or you can send it to myself and I will forward those on to the correct area. If you can either message it, you can respond back to the email that was sent you with a confirmation number that'll come directly back to me. That's a good way to get up with it. If you forget the email addresses, just go back to that confirmation email and you can reply to that and that'll come to me. You can also message it on the Facebook pages. We do check those messages as well. If you've missed any of the previous recordings, they are in the chat box. The link to view those is in the chat box, and then this one will be up in a few days on that link as well. So with that, I am going to, since this is the last of the series, there's no further announcements, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Potts to do some more introductions and to talk to you about nutrition and feeding.
All right, thanks, Megan. So as Megan said, my name is Sarah Potts. I am the Dairy and Beef Extension Specialist with the University of Maryland. Also on the call today is Rachel Slattery. She is also involved with Dairy and Beef Extension in the Department of Animal Science at the University of Maryland. And then Jeff Semler is also going to be helping us field questions as well. He is our ag agent in Washington County and has a lot of experience with cattle as well. So as we go through, if you have questions, please type them into the chat box and Rachel and Jeff will be monitoring that for me and we will get to them at the end. I just want to let everybody know that this session is going to be recorded so that folks can view it later, or if you want to go back and watch it later, you're more than welcome to do so. As Megan said, this is our last Monday Moves session and the topic for today is cattle nutrition and feeding. So with feeding cattle, you might be a little overwhelmed by thinking about it because nutrition can be kind of an overwhelming topic. There's a lot of things to think about when it comes to nutrition. You have feed selection, you have to think about the animal health, you have to think about how the animal is going to respond and produce to the nutrition program that you're implementing. You have to think about profitability, and then you have to think about how you're going to monitor and assess this program. So it can be really overwhelming to think about. So today we're just going to kind of break it down and simplify it a little bit for you so it's a little bit less overwhelming. So the first thing I recommend folks to do is start out with a goal. We should be feeding our animals with an intention and not just throwing feed at them willy-nilly and hoping that they are going to do well. The general goal for a nutrition program should be to utilize available feeds to formulate a cost-effective and balanced diet. So by cost-effective, we mean getting the most bang for your buck, right? Getting the most out of your investment, because feed is a huge expense for any livestock enterprise. And for a balanced diet, we mean a diet that's going to meet the nutrient requirements of the animal to ensure that the animal is performing to your desire or how you want the animal to grow. So there are several steps that we will follow to build what we call a balanced diet. The first step is going to be defining the animal. And we'll go through each of these in more detail, but the first step is defining the animal. The second step is to list the feeds you have available. The third step is to formulate a diet. The fourth step is to feed the animal. And the last step is to evaluate and adjust as needed. So we're first going to start talking about how we define the animal. And that's going to consider things like the animal size, the rate of gain, the amount of milk it's producing, if it's a cow, and things like that. So we're going to start here. When we talk about defining the animal, we really are talking about describing the animal so that we can figure out what nutrients it requires. And that's because the nutrient requirements of an animal are going to vary depending on several different factors. And the more accurate the animal description is, the better. I kind of like to go back to the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. So if you have a really poor animal description, it makes it really difficult to formulate a diet to meet the animal's nutrient requirements economically. So nutrient requirements can vary depending on several different things, and a lot of the things will include things like maintenance, growth, lactation, reproduction, tissue replenishment, which just means that after, so for example, a cow calves, she's lactating and nursing a calf, she oftentimes will lose a little bit of her body fat stores during that period. So tissue replenishment is just the amount of time, or the process of building those fat stores back up after she weans that calf. And then activity also will go into determining an animal's nutrient requirement. And we're just going to go through very briefly some of these factors next here. Maintenance is the level of nutrition required to maintain basic functions without body weight loss or gain. So if you think about, say, a mature breeding bull, for example, who's just hanging out in the field, it's not breeding season, he's in the off season. We don't really want him to gain or lose weight, we just want him to just hang out, right? So he would be fed, a perfect example of an animal that would be fed for maintenance, right? So maintenance requirements must be met before additional nutrients can be used to support production, like growth, reproduction, lactation, etc. And maintenance requirements are dictated typically by two major factors. The first one is body size. So larger animals are generally going to have a higher maintenance requirement. And the second one is environment. Now, a lot of factors go into environment that can affect maintenance requirements, but the one I like to use as an example is an animal that's in extreme, say, cold conditions versus an animal that's not in extreme cold conditions. The animal that's subject to extreme cold conditions is going to have a higher maintenance requirement because it's going to need more energy, more nutrition to maintain its body temperature compared to an animal that is under, say a pasture condition when it's 50 degrees outside. In terms of production, I just have out here the three major categories we often think about in terms of production: growth, reproduction, and lactation. Growth is the addition of body mass, and requirements for growth are going to vary depending on the type of growth the animal is achieving. So if it's a younger animal, it's generally going to be growing more frame, like bone and muscle and things like that. And it's going to have a different requirement compared to an animal that's more mature, and it's going to be gaining more fat. For reproduction, we kind of subdivide this usually into two different categories: breeding and gestation. For breeding, we just want to make sure that requirements are being met so we can make sure that the animals are in appropriate body condition, which we'll talk about a little bit later, to maximize fertility. And then during gestation, we also want to make sure we meet the nutrition requirements to support fetuses as well as the appropriate body condition before calving. And then lastly, for lactation, a lot of times this is considered to be one of the more demanding production stages of our animals, where they need a lot of nutrition and a lot of attention. But this requirement is going to vary depending on the amount and composition of the milk, so the amount of fat and protein in the milk. And a lot of times, lactation requirements are going to be more demanding in the first 2 to 3 months compared to the last, couple months before she weans her calf. Just to give you an example of how these requirements change depending on the type of animal and what the animal is doing. So if cow 1, she's pregnant, let's say that she's 1 month before calving, so she's getting ready to calve. We look up her energy and protein requirements, but she needs around 15 megacalories of energy and around 600 grams of protein per day. Now we compare her to cow 2, who is lactating, and she is 1 month post-calving. Her energy requirements are kind of similar, but a little bit higher, but her protein requirements are higher. And that's because she's producing milk to support her calf. Now we compare that to cow 3, who is also lactating, but she's 6 months post-calving, so she's probably getting close to start weaning her calf. And if she's in the breeding herd, she's probably pregnant, but she's only in her first or second trimester. And we look at her energy requirements, they're a bit lower than these 2 cows. And they're also, she also has a lower protein requirement as well. So again, I just wanted to show you an example of how these requirements do fluctuate depending on the physiological state of the animals. So you might be wondering where I got those numbers for energy and protein requirements for those cows. I didn't just make them up. They came from a document that is published by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. They have a series called, put up by the National Research Council, or the NRC, that will detail nutrient requirements for different species of animals. So there's an NRC document specifically for nutrient requirements of dogs and cats. There's one for horses, beef cattle, dairy cattle, small ruminants, the list goes on. And that information, those documents can be found at this link here. I just want to make you aware of these resources. Obviously, I don't say you should go out and read them by any means, but if you're curious, that's where additional information can be found. These documents are published periodically and updated. So though some of them do get kind of dated before they decide to run an update. So the most recent beef cattle NRC was published in 2016. That document is available for purchase, but the previous version to that, which is from 2000, it is available for free at that link on the slide, and that is still a really good resource, even though it is a little bit dated. So in terms of building our balanced diet, we've defined our animal, we've kind of talked about why that's important and how, differences and how the animal's producing affects the nutrition requirements. Now we're going to talk about our feeds. And when we're talking about our feeds, we really want to pay special attention to how much is available and the nutrient profile of those feeds. There are several different feeds we can give to cattle. The 2 major categories of those feeds are going to be forages and concentrates. Forages are going to be feeds that are high in fiber, so we usually use 18% as the cut point for the definition of forage versus concentrate. Forages are going to be less digestible or less readily digestible than concentrates, and they're usually going to be fed to ruminants and hindgut fermenters like horses, rabbits, and things like that. And the reason for that is that these 2 groups of animals have extensive microbial fermentation or microbial digestion in their digestive system that allows them to efficiently digest and utilize the material in forages. If we contrast to concentrates, these feeds are generally lower in fiber and they're pretty readily digestible. And they're usually fed to all farm animal species. So think things like corn and soybean meal and things like that. Those are going to be fed to cattle, but also animals like pigs and chickens and things like that. To break down the forage categories a little bit further, we have 3 major categories. We have hay, which is typically stored dry. Examples of hay include orchard grass, fescue, alfalfa, legume hay, etc. The list goes on, but those are some common examples in this area. We also have pasture, which is usually grazed. And then if you break that down further, there are several categories of pasture. We have perennial versus annuals, cool season versus warm seasons, and grasses versus legumes. So if you're interested in working pasture into your nutrition program, those are terms that you're probably going to start seeing as you do your reading. The last category of forages is silage, and these are feeds that are going to be stored wet and preserved in an anaerobic or oxygen-free environment so they don't spoil or get moldy. Examples of silages are corn silage, alfalfa silage, and grass silage, which is sometimes called haylage. Again, these are the 3 major categories of feeds or forages for cattle that you'll oftentimes see. For concentrates, we generally will break these down into 3 categories as well. We have sources of energy, which include our cereal grains like corn, barley, and wheat. We also have some byproduct feeds that will also suffice for energy sources. including hominy, wheat middlings, and beet pulp. We have protein sources, and the one that usually comes to mind is soybean meal because that's commonly fed to a lot of our livestock species as a source of protein. But we also have the advantage for cattle, for livestock to feed byproduct feeds, so things like canola meal, distillers, brewers grains, and corn gluten meal, which are also good protein sources as well. And then lastly, we have minerals and vitamins. And a lot of times folks will purchase a complete mix and offer it to their cattle that way, either mix it into a concentrate if they're supplementing with grain, or they'll put it into a mineral feeder out in the pasture. And minerals of particular interest that you want to pay attention to are calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and selenium. Obviously, there are a lot of minerals involved in cattle nutrition that are important, but those are the 4 major ones that we will oftentimes start looking at first. So when choosing feeds, there are a couple of things you need to consider. The first is what is available and what's feasible. And when you're considering this, it's important to think about economics as well as practicality. You also need to consider your goals and feeding capabilities. So if your goal is to be confinement, you're obviously not going to be utilizing a lot of pasture in your feeding program. And if conversely, if you're forage only, you're probably not interested in supplementing grain. So you're not going to go buy a load of distillers grain, right? And then the last thing you need to consider is what type of animal you're feeding. So we talked about the description of the animal and how nutrient requirements change depending on the animal's physiological state. But that information is useful in terms of selecting feed, especially if you're making purchases. For example, an early lactation cow is going to need a really high energy dense diet compared to a dry, non-lactating pregnant cow who's basically at maintenance, okay? When choosing feeds, it's also really important to evaluate their nutrient composition. And this is particularly important for our forages and byproduct feeds. You can visually appraise them, so that's really common practice for looking at hay, for example. But looks can be really deceiving, so it's really important to have a feed analysis completed. So it's a chemical analysis that will tell you exactly the nutrient profile of the feed that you send in. We recommend doing a feed analysis whenever you get a new cutting of hay or a new harvest date. For byproduct feeds, if you have a new purchase lot, or if anytime you have poor animal performance that you can't really figure out why, it's a good idea to test your forages or your byproducts to see if there's anything going on there that could be explaining some of the problems you might be having. For obtaining a feed analysis, I just wanted to walk you through step by step what that entails because it sounds really complicated to some folks. But it's really simple. The first step would be to collect a feed sample. It's really important to ensure you get a representative, uniform sample. And for hay and baled hay and silages, you can get a core sample and you can use a hay probe for that. If you need assistance with that, you can contact your local extension office. Most offices will have a hay probe that you can borrow for such purposes. The next thing you would do is ship the sample to the lab, but make sure to label the sample with the information that they request. So things like feed type, the type of analysis you want, etc. Most basic analysis packages are sufficient for balancing a basic diet for cattle. And the basic test will generally range from $18 to $25 per sample. So it's really not that expensive if you're only testing a couple feeds a few times a year. And then after you submit the sample to the lab, generally you'll receive the results within a week. Oftentimes it's a lot faster than that. So the turnaround time is pretty quick. So that's all you need to do for getting a feed analysis completed. So again, it's a really simple process, but it can have a really big impact on your nutrition program. All right, so we've defined our animal, we've talked about feeds. The next step is to formulate a diet. And this is where things get a little bit complex, especially if you don't like numbers or math. So buckle up, and we're just gonna go through a couple of examples on how we can formulate a diet. Before we do that, I just wanna go through a few definitions that are important for formulating diets for animals. The first definition is dry matter, and that is the proportion of feed that does not contain any water. The reason why that's an important term is because diets are often formulated on a dry matter basis to remove the effect that water content has on feed nutrient density. So we think about silage, for example, it's about 70% moisture versus hay that is only 20% or 15% moisture. That water is going to have an effect on how nutrient dense a pound of each of those feeds is going to be. Some other terms to be familiar with, the major nutrients that we're going to talk about today are going to be protein and energy, and I just wanted to give you an overview of some of the terms that are associated with those two nutrient categories. Protein is a nutrient that's required for tissue growth and several different bodily functions. And the common protein terms you'll see in cattle nutrition are going to be crude protein, or CP, and metabolizable protein, or MP. And then for energy, that's our nutrient that's required to fuel all metabolic functions. And our major terms that you'll see thrown around are going to be net energy, NE, metabolizable energy, or ME, and then total digestible nutrients, or TDN. And the reason why there's so many different variations of each nutrient is kind of confusing. It sounds like folks with the NRC documents can't make up their mind. Is because there's varying degrees of accuracy associated with each of these terms. But for today, we're going to be focusing on crude protein for our protein measurement and TDN for our energy measurement, because those are the most common things you will see in livestock nutrition at the farm level. So to formulate a diet, there's a couple of basic steps that we'll follow. The first step is going to be gathering basic information, things like your animal description, so age, body weight, production, etc. You also want to have an idea of how much your animals are going to eat. As a general rule of thumb, we generally say that between 2 and 3% of body weight is a pretty good indicator of how much the animal will eat on a dry matter basis. And then you also have to have an idea of the feeds you have available, or the feeds that you're planning to purchase. The next step is to look up the requirements for the nutrients that you're worried about. So in this case, we're going to be talking about protein and energy, but you can look up the requirements for other nutrients as well. And again, this information can be found through that Beef Cattle NRC document at this link here. I just gave you the link because I'm not going to make you, obviously you don't have to go look it up, but I just wanted to show you where it's coming from so you know I'm not just making it up. And again, the previous version of the Beef Cattle NRC that was published in 2000 is freely available to download. And then the last step is to actually formulate the diet, which there are several different options you can follow. You can use an Excel spreadsheet, you can use pen and paper, and then you can get really sophisticated and use a computer program or even hire a consultant to do this for you. But I'm just going to go through a few quick and easy ways you can kind of figure out how you're doing with your nutrition program, just either using a computer or pen and paper. So we're going to go through an example of figuring out how we're going to feed a group of heifers. So for this example, we have replacement heifers that weigh 500 pounds, and we're going to feed them. But before we do that, we need to make sure we have an idea of what our expected production level is, because that goes into our animal description. So we'll use this information here in this box to figure out what our average daily gain should be. So to do that, again, these are replacement heifers, so we're going to breed them. We have to know our mature weight of our cows. So we're going to say an average of 1,200 pounds. Our mature cows are 1,200 pounds. Our target weight is going to be around 780 pounds, because that's how big we want them to be at breeding, which is about 65% of our mature weight. The amount of gain needed by difference, 500 minus, or 780 minus 500 is 280 pounds. And then let's say they were weighed, the 15th of September, and they needed to gain that weight by the beginning of breeding season, which is the beginning of the 1st of May. So there's 228 days till breeding. So this number and the amount of gain needed are useful for us to calculate a target average daily gain. So we want these heifers to gain 1.2 pounds per day. And then we also can estimate our feed intake using that rule of 2% of body weight. So 2% of 500 is 10 pounds per day. So these are the 3 key pieces of information we need to move forward and for balancing a diet for these animals. So we'll take this information and go to that Beef Cattle NRC document, And I've pulled out some numbers to kind of summarize it, make it easier to look at. But what this is showing you is for a 500-pound growing animal, these are the target nutrient densities of the diet. So this is the target diet TDN, and this is the target crude protein that you want for your diets if they have these different levels of body weight gain. Now, it's important to remember with animal nutrition that these animals have requirements for quantities of nutrient, not percentages. A lot of times, as a quick and easy way to evaluate a diet, folks will just look at the concentration of the diet. But it's really important to also consider the amount of nutrient the animals are getting as well. So I like to work in terms of amount of nutrient the animal is getting. But again, a lot of folks in the industry will also use the content or the percentage of these nutrients in the diet as well. So that's why I show you both. So for our example, we want our cattle to be gaining 1.2 pounds per day. So this is the line that we're going to be focusing on in terms of TDN and crude protein content in the diet, as well as the amounts of TDN and crude protein we want our animals to have. So going through this example, option 1, what are we going to feed? The first option is pasture only. So let's say you have a fescue pasture and you sent in samples for analysis and they came back as 15% crude protein and 63% TDN, so pretty good pasture. If we look at, I pulled these values from that table I just showed you just as a reminder so we don't forget about them. So if we look at that table, look at those values for our target crude protein and TDN content of the diet, we'd see that our protein and our TDN content of the pasture well exceed our targets. So if there are sufficient quantities of this pasture available, this would do fine as a sole feed source. Obviously, you would probably want to also supplement some mineral in there as well. But in terms of energy and protein, this pasture would do fine. But let's say there's not enough pasture for all of the heifers to eat. So what would you do in this situation? A lot of folks would turn to supplemental hay. So if we did this, we wanted to feed pasture and supplemental hay. Let's say we still have the same fescue pasture, but we estimate that there's only enough pasture out there to feed 5 pounds per head per day. So we still have 5 more pounds that we need to feed because we think they're going to eat around 10 pounds a day. So we're gonna look at purchasing grass hay and at a rate of 5 pounds per head per day. And you might be wondering when you make this purchase, what's the minimum protein and TDN content you can get away with this hay? So to figure this out, you can do a little bit of simple math to figure out how much protein and TDN the pasture is going to supply these animals. So if you look at protein, the pasture is 15% protein. At 5 pounds per day, it's going to give the animals about 3/4 pound of protein per day. Same thing with TDN. It's 63% TDN. At 5 pounds per day, it's going to be giving the animals about 3 pounds of TDN per day. So if we look at, we want to know how much more protein and energy you need. So you can figure that out by difference. So you look at your target crude protein content, or target crude protein amount that you need for your cattle, subtract what's being supplied by the pasture, and we get around 0.45 pounds deficit in crude protein. We do the same thing with our TDN. We take our target TDN, subtract out what's being supplied by the pasture, and we're left with a deficit of 2.7 pounds of TDN per day. So we'll divide that among the 5 pounds of hay that we're going to feed to these cattle, and we can figure out that the hay at minimum needs to be 9% crude protein and 54% TDN. Now that's important economically because that lets you know that you can buy a poor quality hay and save some money and it would still be sufficient. Now, of course, if your pasture conditions change, you would need to account for that as well in this scenario. So option 3 would involve feeding hay and grain only. So this would be a common option for wintertime feeding. So say it's wintertime, there's no pasture really available and you want to bring the animals into a dirt lot or a sacrifice area and you're not really concerned with them getting any nutrition from their pasture. So in this scenario, let's say you have 2 feeds. You have your mixed grass hay, which is tested at 10% protein and 58% TDN. And then you have a grain mix that has a guaranteed analysis of 17% protein, and it's estimated to be about 75% TDN. Now with this type of scenario, we're going to pursue a different kind of approach to balancing a diet to figure out what proportion or how much hay and how much grain you need to feed your animals. So we're going to use something called the Pearson square method, which is a pretty simple method to balancing a ration that has only 2 ingredients in it. So for this method, you take the target content of the nutrient. So for this example, we're just going to use protein. So our target crude protein of the diet is 12.2%, and put that in the box. And then we'll list our 2 feed ingredients with their respective protein content. So hay at 10% protein and grain at 17%. And then what we'll do is we're going to subtract on the diagonal. So for hay, we're going to take the difference between 12.2 and 10, which is 2.2. And that's going to give us the parts of grain that we need in our end ration. We'll do the same thing for our grain. We'll subtract across. So take the difference between 17 and 12.2, which is 4.8 parts hay. And then finally, we get our total parts. So we add up 4.8 parts plus 2.2 is 7 parts total. And so from that, we can figure out what percentage the diet needs to be of hay versus what percentage it needs to be of grain. So to do that, we'll just start with hay. To do that, we'll do 4.8 divided by 7, and we get that the diet needs to be around 69% hay. We'll do the same thing with the grain. 2.2 divided by 7 gives you 31% grain. And then you multiply both of these percentages by our estimated feed intake of 10 pounds, and we get that we need to feed around 6.9 pounds per head per day of hay and around 3.1 pounds per day of grain. So that's just the quick and easy, simple way to do a 2-ingredient ration for cattle or really any livestock. But if you add more ingredients, obviously this gets to be a little bit more complex and complicated, and we're not going to go there today. But I just wanted to give you a few different options and ways to think about balancing a diet for cattle, short of so that you don't have to, feel obligated to go use some complex ration balancing system. There are also a couple of guidelines out there for general targets for nutrient content of different diets. So depending on the type of animal. So for this chart showing you different animal types, and it's showing you the target TDN and crude protein contents of the diets for those particular types of animals. This is a rough guide, so it can be useful if you're just ballparking something, but in terms of getting down into the nitty-gritty, I recommend going, and actually doing some of the steps that we talked about previously. But if we think about our example, we had our growing cattle. They were pretty close to mature weight, not quite 50% of mature weight, but they're pretty close to the edge. And our TDN recommendation here is 65%. Compare that to the actual TDN requirement or recommendation that we had was around 59%, so that's pretty close here. And then crude protein, from our previous example, it was the recommendation was around 12.2%, and that's pretty close here as well. So again, this is a pretty good guide, but again, if you want to be accurate and precise, it's best to go through these steps we talked about previously. So we've defined our animal, we listed our available feeds, we formulated a diet. The next step would be to feed the animal, which generally is the simplest part of this whole process, though sometimes things do go wrong. But we're not going to really talk a whole lot about feeding the animal because we talked about housing and feeding facilities last week. But the last step we're going to jump to, which I argue is probably as important as defining the animal, which is our first step over here, is evaluating and adjusting. And how do we evaluate our nutrition program? So you might be asking yourself, well, how do we know if we've done a good job? I like to say that the animals will tell you, but you need to be listening and looking for the right things. So some things to consider when evaluating a nutrition program are body condition, performance, health, and feed intake. Now, performance, health, and feed intake are kind of nondescript indicators of a nutrition program because other things can be impacting, performance and things like that. So we're going to focus the rest of today on body condition specifically because it is a really good indicator of how your nutrition program is doing. So body condition is the evaluation of the amount of fat or flesh that an animal carries. And a scoring system is going to vary depending on species, but the concept is going to be the same. An ideal body condition is going to vary depending on an animal's physiological state. It's a really important monitoring tool for all nutrition programs, but it's a really critical tool for any system that involves breeding females, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. For our cow-calf operations, or anyone who's raising a cow to have a calf, ideally, at a minimum, we want you to score your animals 60 days before calving, at calving, and at breeding. Now, you can score more often than that, but these are considered the bare minimum times that you want to score your animals, because it will give you a really good indicator of how well you're meeting those animals' nutrition requirements during those critical times. Body condition is useful to evaluate the effectiveness of a diet. So an underconditioned animal is an animal that's undernourished. And it's indicating to you that it either needs more feed or it needs an increased nutrient density of a feed. On the flip side, an overconditioned animal is one that is overnourished, and it's indicating to you that it needs either reduced nutrient density or it needs less feed. So just to give you a visual, we're going to show you more visuals here in the next couple slides, but this is obviously a very thin animal, so that would be considered underconditioned. And then this is obviously a very obese animal that's overconditioned. With body condition scoring, it's important that the same individuals evaluate the condition on a routine basis. So the reason for that is because body condition scoring is a fairly subjective measurement. For example, what Rachel calls a 4.5, I might call it 5, which is fine, but it's important that the two of us are doing this, scoring the animals consistently every time we score, so that we keep that relative assessment of body condition. To hammer home why body condition is important for our breeding females or for our animals that are going to have calves. For our animals that are thin, so we'll talk about score in a minute, but for animals that are thin, so less than a 4, they're going to have issues with fertility. So they might not cycle, they might not conceive as easily, which will lead to increased calving intervals. And then it might trickle down to decreased calf vigor because those thin animals might not be milking as much. So the calves aren't getting as much milk from their mamas. On the flip side, animals that are over-conditioned, they're costly to maintain because you're feeding them really expensive feeds or forages or what have you that they don't need. If they are close to calving and they're over-conditioned, you're going to have increased incidence of calving difficulty or dystocia. You also have issues with fertility as well if they are over-conditioned. So they won't cycle as easily or as often, or they might not cycle as quickly after calving, and they might fail to conceive more frequently. In terms of what the body condition score scale looks like in beef cattle, it's a scale of 1 to 9. 1 is emaciated, whereas a 9 is really obese. So where we want to shoot for in our beef cattle is somewhere around a 5 or a 6. Generally for our first calf heifers that are getting ready to have their first baby, we want them to calve at around a 6, whereas our cows, we're a little bit more lenient. They can calve around a 5, 5.5, or a 6. So you might be thinking that that is really overwhelming. There's 9 pictures on that last slide, and how am I ever going to figure out, what my cattle look like compared to that slide? There are several tools and charts out there that are trying to help simplify the process for folks. And I like this chart a lot because it does break it down into really easily quantifiable categories, if you will, for each of these traits. So for example, if we look at outline of ribs, anything less than a 3, you're going to be able to see all the ribs. If it's a score of 4, you might see anywhere from 3 to 5 ribs. If you see between 1 and 2 ribs, it's a score of 5. And then if you don't see any ribs, it's 6 or above. So that's this chart helps to break it down and make it a little bit simpler. In terms of key areas to look, there's certain areas you want to look at on the animal to assess body condition. The first area is going to be the ribs. The second area is going to be the spinous process on the backbone. So that's going to be in this loin region here. The third area is going to be the transverse processes along the side of the loin. You also have the hooks and the pins, the tail head, as well as the shoulder area or brisket area. So those are the major areas you're going to want to look at when assessing condition. For those who are starting out, I like to tell folks to start by looking at the ribs. And if you can see 2 or more ribs, then the score is probably going to be at a 5 or lower. And then if you want to go further, if you're on the lower end of that, if it's going to be lower than a 5, if you can easily see the outline of the spinous processes on the top of the backbone in the loin region, it's going to be likely a 4 or lower at that point. But at least this trick with the ribs is really nice in terms of dividing that 9-point scale into like half. So it makes it easier for you to assess body condition that way. In terms of how we go about looking at body condition, a lot of folks will do visual appraisal, so they'll just look at the animal. And that's acceptable, but it's really important that when you're doing that to be mindful of the thickness of the hair coat, especially in the wintertime and the early spring when the coats are really thick, because that thick hair coat, as you can imagine, can kind of mask, especially our thin animals, things that we want to be assessing with body condition. So because of that, we really prefer tactile or touch appraisal. It does require a bit more time, and it does require a bit more work, as well as facilities to actually restrain the animal to do this properly. But it is definitely more accurate than the visual appraisal. So we've gone through our whole process of our nutrition program. We've defined our animal, we've listed our feeds, we've made a diet, we've fed the animal, we've gone through how we're going to adjust or how we're going to evaluate the ration to decide whether or not we need to make any adjustments. So at this point, we're thinking everything looks good. But as with all management practices and programs with livestock, the nutrition program should always be monitored continuously and routinely to determine if adjustments are needed. And adjustments should be made, or at least evaluated, if anything along this chain changes. So if the animal description changes or the feeds available changes, you need to adjust your program accordingly. And with that, we'll take any questions. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and we'll take them.